Bag number 7 gets the front end together as a completed assembly and includes the front sway bar, steering brace, upper arms, and front shock tower. I start by getting all the required parts trimmed off the tree mold. I find that some of these parts are a bit too thin for me to use my flash trimmers on, so I just use the hobby knife I normally use for trimming my bodies. I'm sure most of you watching already know from past experiences building kits that there is a preferred way to install the ball ends into the end links, but I'm going to touch on it real briefly for anyone who might not know. I say preferred way rather than the correct way because you can still press the ball into the end link either way by forcing it. Doing so, however, may cause it to fit tighter and leave the sway bar or camber links unable to articulate as freely as they should. To identify this, there is usually one side of the end link that will have a slight gloss to it and an impression around the bore where the ball snaps into place. You will find that pressing the ball into the link is considerably easier, especially when using the fitting on most shock pliers that is specifically for pressing ball ends into the end link for sway bars and camber links. Like I was saying, using the shock pliers to press the ball into the bore requires minimal effort. Once it snaps into place, make sure it is in and is moving freely without bind. If there is any bind, you can press the ball back out using your shock pliers and trying it again. I have found that some kits use harder plastics and will fit tighter and break in and get much looser as it goes on. For these steps, also pay close attention to the placement and orientation of the ends that get pressed into the links. Most of the time, there is a completely round ball that will be the attachment point for the link to the lower arm. The other will have a ball and a bore where the sway bar will pass through it, with a threaded hole for a set screw that will be for fine-tuning the sway bar. More on that later. You will have to repeat the steps to complete 2 assemblies of the sway bar end links to prepare them to attach to the lower arms. Attach the completed sway bar links to the lower arms with the M3 by 19 2.5 screws. I use my electric driver on these steps as it saves time, but as I said in previous videos, I don't lock them in with the driver. I will take them until they bottom out and then hand tighten from there. Once the screw stops turning, I check to make sure that the attached sway bar link moves freely with no bind. If it is binding, it is a good bet you went too far and need to back out the screw until it starts to move freely again, plus a quarter turn more. Repeat this step on the other side. Now let's get on with installing the sway bar onto the end links, securing it to the transmission case. Take note that there are 2 halves to what I call the sway bar retention brace that will secure the sway bar to the transmission case. One side goes on first, then the sway bar, then the front cover that includes the mounting holes for the screws to secure it. I got ahead of myself and almost forgot it. I was using my cell phone to reference the manual at this point, and I had it zoomed into a previous step and didn't see that other part. I would get both ends of the sway bar through the bore to the tops of the end links to hold the sway bar in place. I won't thread the set screws in just yet until I'm ready to set the sway bar and complete the assembly. Notice how far I get before I looked up from the camera to notice the other half of the part sitting there. It's a good thing the original audio is not here because I felt pretty dumb and I let myself know just how dumb I thought that was. I secure the 2 halves of the sway bar brace to the transmission case using the 4 and 2.5 by 8 screws. I will get these 4 screws into the diff case tight until they stop and make sure they are snug with another quarter turn. Once the sway bar is secured to the diff case, I will pull the sway bar from the sway bar end links and prepare to set the set screw. I start threading the set screws into the cover plate of the sway bar retention brace, and I will swivel the sway bar up and down continuously while I'm threading the set screw. I'll keep threading the set screw until the sway bar no longer swivels freely. Once I feel it stop, I will usually let it go and it is usually stuck. I will then unthread that set screw until the sway bar moves freely again, plus a quarter turn for good measure. I'll repeat the same steps on the other set screw. Once it's complete, I'll make sure the sway bar continues to move freely without binding before moving on. Now I'll reinsert the sway bar through the end link and set it with the provided set screws. Setting how much of the sway bar will protrude past the end link is something every driver fine-tunes for themselves. There are several videos on this topic and many schools of thought to this setting and how it applies to handling. I've learned that for me, it's best to start with what I feel is neutral and then tune the suspension from there during practice at the track. For me, a neutral setting is the sway bar being flush with the end of the sway bar link. I'll use my finger as a stop and feel for when the sway bar end is flush with the link and then tighten the set screw from there. I do not use thread lock on these set screws as I've never had one back out, and seeing as they are M3s, they are susceptible to stripping, especially if you use thread lock. I'll repeat the step on the opposite side and then check the assembly for plays side to side. For now, I think the play is a little too excessive and I might install some collars on the other side to limit it, but I'll wait and see how it feels with the track during braking. One more thing I wanted to mention, I try to orientate these adjustments as screws in such a way that they will be easily visible and accessible in the pits. You should be able to come in and ask your pit team to adjust the sway bar as easily as you can ask for an hour on top from your driver's stand. Next up is preparing the steering brace for the attachment of the upper arm assembly. The front body mount is attached to the carbon upper steering brace with the M3x8 screws. Take note that the aluminum inserts are to be facing down and the upper arm holder is set in place with the M3x8s as well. Now you can install the upper arm pills set in the middle mounting position. Now comes the installation of the front shock tower. Insert 2 upper arm pills also in the middle mounting position and mock it up on the front diff case, WIRC logo facing forward. Now attach it using 4 of the supplied M3x14 screws. I'll use the electric driver on this one to save time, and as usual I bottom out and then hand tighten. You don't have to use an electric driver obviously, but it's faster and easier on the hands, especially at my age. Get the screws good and tight using your best judgment on when to stop tightening. Now we can move on to the final step with back 7, the attachment of the upper arms. I locate the upper arms and orientate them the same way and insert the hinge pins. I slide them through the bore for a test fit, and as with the rest of the components, they fit as expected and they are nice and free with zero bind. I locate the arm spacers I trimmed earlier and snap them onto the end of the hinge pin where they will mate up with the pills previously installed on the front shock tower, and repeat the step for the opposite side. Now the manual does not specify which thicknesses of the spacers go where, but you can see on the manual that the thinner the spacers are closest to the shock tower, and the thicker ones are for the upper arm and steering brace. Once you insert the hinge pins onto the steering brace assembly, there is enough play to fit the 2 remaining spacers to close up the gap and make the assembly solid. Now to complete the assembly, attach the brace with the M3 screws, getting them good and tight, and you should be good to go. Now I give the entire assembly a good once over. Make sure everything is moving, articulated, and pivoted as it should. It should feel solid but move very free with no binding anywhere. Now on to bag number 8, the front uprights and installation of the pillow balls. So bag number 8 for me is going to be a new experience. This will be the first pillow ball car I've ever built. So I'm definitely going to take the time to familiarize myself with the parts a bit more than I usually would for a C-Hub car that I know well by now. As I get the parts broken out, the only obvious part is the difference in steel and aluminum pillow balls in the kit. Press the flange 8x16x5 bearing into the outer bore and the 15x21x4 bearing into the inner bore of the steering block. Next, I will assemble the CVA driveline using the wheel hub, drive shaft, and coupler. Note that there are 2 distinctive size pins in this step, but the CVA assembly uses the larger of the 2 pins. You will have to line up the slot of the drive shaft with the hole in the coupler and a hole in the wheel hub. Once you line them up, insert the pin. It might take a little finesse at first, but it will see correctly pretty quick. Slide the assembled CVA through the steering block until it stops. You should see the hole where the last drive pin will pass through on the outer side of the steering block. If you don't, it could be that the inner bearing is not seated fully, causing the hub not to pass through fully. Slide one of the included standard width hexes and clock it so that the hole in the hex lines up with the hole in the driveline. Optional hex widths are available in a +1 and +2 mm offset. These are great tuning aids for the right track conditions, but experimentation is the best way to find which one suits the track and your driving style. Slide the pin through the hole in the hex and wheel hub. You might get a bit of resistance if the holes are not perfectly aligned, but you can manipulate it a bit to get them right and the pin should slide through. Make sure the pin is evenly distributed. You should not see one end of the pin in farther or protruding out the other side. It should sit flush with the hex. Locate the grub screw that will thread into the end of the hub and secure the drive pin into the hex. This step is crucial to get right because if it comes loose, Murphy's Law will come back to you while you're on the driver's stand having your best run ever, and then you'll see your front tire continue on straight with your buggy not following. As I stated earlier, any parts that are going to be secured with Loctite should be cleaned with brake cleaner to remove any oils or impurities to ensure the Loctite holds. I will add a bit more of the Loctite than I normally would for this step, but not by much. I'll get a good coat on the threads and then screw it in and thread it until it stops. I'll grab my wheel wrench that has a 17mm hex opening that will hold the hex in place to give you the leverage you'll need to really torque that screw down. Avoid using channel locks or vice grips if you can unless you have to. They can mar up the hex pretty good and damage it if you're not careful. Fancy tools are not a necessity in this hobby, but the right tool can make a job easier to do right the first time. I'll take a look at it once it's tight and make sure it looks good and clean out any excess thread locker that may have been pushed out. Spin the assembly and make sure it spins freely with no binding or excessive play, and repeat the steps for the opposite side. Now moving on to installing the pillow balls into the steering blocks. The steel pillow ball will go in on the lower half and the aluminum pillow ball on the upper. I don't know why, but I'm just demonstrating that one is in fact magnetic and therefore the steel pillow ball and the other is not. I follow it up by inserting the plastic covers over the pillows and then the adjustment nut for each. I'll start threading the adjustment nut into place by hand and then follow it up with tightening them down, taking care not to thread it in off-center to avoid cross-threading the plastic threads. I did go back and forth with this a bit because I kept feeling like it was cross-threading, but in the end it was just the angles of the steering blocks throwing me off. It never hurts to check and recheck. Once completed, check the movement of the pillow balls in the sockets to make sure that they are moving and articulating freely with no signs of binding. You'll need to repeat these steps on the opposite side. To complete bag number 8, I will attach what the part number describes as the carbon steering levers. If you notice, the steering blocks are designed in such a way where one part number can be used for both left and right hand applications. It's nice to know that you don't have to carry two different part numbers for the same function. For this step, you do have to take note of which steering block is right versus left based on how you assemble them to ensure the steering lever is secured or orientated the correct way for the side you are installing. You will also notice that the steering lever has an indentation, if you will, that will align on the steering block to ensure a level and secure mounting surface. Secure the levers using the provided M3x12 screws and get them tight without stripping. This part will be under some stress during hard quartering, so strip screws will not exactly be ideal for this assembly. Repeat the step for both left and right sides. Next up, I will thread the pillow balls into the upper and lower arms. You will need a 2.5 driver for this part as I use a combination of hand tightening and using the electric driver. I use the 2.5 to get the threads going and then will come in behind and use the electric driver to finish the job. Also, take note to make sure your drive shaft is fully seated to the outdrive in the front diff and insert the flat washer onto the lower pillow ball threads before you thread it into the arm. I will thread in both the upper and lower pillow balls, trying to thread them in equally as I go. The camber lock washer will tend to move off until you put enough pressure on it to keep it in place with the indentation that's machined into it. I thread the upper pillow ball as far as I can, leaving enough space to insert the lock washer and then finish tightening it down. I will tighten down both upper and lower pillow balls until they stop up against the upper and lower arms. I snug them up tight and give the completed side a check, moving the parts up and down and making sure I am not binding up anywhere. Now I'll just repeat the steps on the other side and I should be good to go. So there it is, the completed front end assembly ready to rock and roll. The last step for me on this bag is to apply some grease to the hubs. I'll use a hobby brush for this to get it applied as evenly as I can. The next video is going to be for bags 9 through 11, which will get the rear end completed, moving me closer to getting the components mounted to the chassis. I want to thank those that have reached out so far with feedback and words of encouragement. Trying to build this car while filming and going back to edit and create the content is a challenge. More so that I have a full-time job, and then I'm a dad full-time, and then I have 2 kids that have multiple hobbies and play sports. I wouldn't have it any other way. That's what am I if not a father before anything else. I'm working on a video to also introduce myself and the California team formally, along with a summary of what is to come for the team and this channel. So I'm going to wrap this one up with thanking you again and hoping you stick with us and come out and join us, or just say hi if you see us at the track. So until the next time, grazie per la visita, stay attento e ci rivedremo.